Hi everyone, welcome to the third episode of our vlog. And this week I've got a few different things I wanted to talk to you about. First one is what I've got sitting over here, and it's the Lhasa cardigan, because that is just getting started with the knit along now. Now I know there's a few other videos around where I'm talking about the construction of it when I was on Instagram, and if you're in the Teachable class and you're actually doing the knit along with me, then obviously all of the actual tutorial videos are up there where I'm going through each section of the project as I'm working on it. So like all of the technical end of things are there. So I kind of thought that it might be more interesting on the vlog here to talk a small bit about the origins of it, and I suppose tied with it, how I come up with designs and how they change as I'm proceeding. Because it's not always the same. Like I find when I come into design, there's lots of different starting spots. The most common one these days for me is the fact that I have my own yarn line. So I'm starting with the yarn and I've got the yarn in my hand. I know the colors, I know what it knits up like, but then it's kind of figuring out what's the season for, what do I feel like knitting, what do I think other knitters who've been knitting along with me for several knit alongs, what would they be interested in? Because it often feels like I'm kind of moving along on a journey with the other knitters who are there. Hopefully, if you've been working through with me on a few, the idea that you get introduced to different types of stitch patterns, different constructions. So like, for instance, if I had one that was a raglan on a previous year, the next year I'm more likely to use a different type of construction to put it together. As part of it's my own interest, and the other part is just to give people a little taster of different ways of constructing your garments and figuring out which works best for your body, which you like creating more, because they're not always the same thing. Sometimes there might be something that we just love knitting, and when we put it on, we don't like it as much as a different type of construction when we wear it, because different constructions fall differently on your body, and while they could be modified, some of them you might just feel better in, that you just might like the way they sit in your body, whether it's more comfortable or whether the shape just suits you and you feel good in it. So it's good to experiment with different types to see if there's something that you haven't touched on before. So that's they're the overarching things when I'm going into the knit along, the yarn, and I'll have a rough idea of construction type in my head. Now, anyone who's been knitting with me for a while will know that I like to vary things a bit in terms of construction. I do find that always having ones where it's like, bottom up, top down, very standard construction, I get a little bit bored of it. So I'll often like to do, which is what I did with the Lhasa, modular, and kind of figure out, okay, if we've got one basic stitch pattern, what's it going to look like if I have some of it working in one direction and some of it working in a different direction? So with the results that if you kind of work through it like that, you can build. It's like, building little sections of it one on each other, and it makes it a little bit easier as well if you're modifying one part, because the other ones won't have as big a knock-on effect as you go through. So that's I suppose the themes, constructions, that kind of end of it. But then stitch patterns, for me, what often ends up happening is it's something I've fallen in love with before and I haven't had a chance to go through it. Because when I'm in classes with people, I'll often bring up older samples that I've done, like particularly from maybe 10, 12 years ago, and there might be some little detail on it that I really had intended on going back to, and I wanted to expand it and dig in a little bit further. It's something when, like in art colleges and things like that, where you do a lot of project work, you typically would spend a lot of time building around a theme. You'll take something and then you'll push it in several different areas, and you'll push it as far as you can. And it often creates very, very interesting effects, because it's like you've explored every possibility of that area as you possibly can. And that is what happened with the stitch pattern, because the stitch pattern is like an oversized stitch pattern, looks a little bit like crochet. Like for someone at a glance looking at it would assume that this was knitting and crochet blended. So it was really quite an unusual looking stitch pattern for knitting. But I had done it once before. I had done a cardigan where it was a oversized lace, but it had a very chunky yarn and it looked totally different on it. And as I was working it, I'm like, I'd really like to see what this looked like on a lighter weight yarn and possibly combined with some other stitch patterns. Because for that, while there was some garter stitch, it was just around the edges. So that was where the lace stitch pattern came. But the design features are often tied with the knitting itself, because as I'm working through it, I realized that it's a stitch pattern that needs a lot of concentration, because there's a lot of increases and decreases, and you're quite focused on that to make sure that you get them correct and you don't lose a stitch anywhere along the way, or decrease an entire 4 stitches as you're going, which can happen. So I wanted to simplify everything else so the stitch pattern itself could take center stage, and if the knitter was focused on that, the other parts were simplified. And that meant that I kept the construction simple. I kept it drop shoulder, and even with the sleeves, I kept the sleeves have no shaping, with it all gathered in at the garter cuff. And that actually worked with the lace stitch pattern, because lace is designed to be flowy, to be drapey, to be blocked quite wide. So a looser stitch pattern where you've got like lots of extra room on it actually works quite well. And even with the sleeve, the fact that you've got normally a sleeve that didn't have any shaping isn't going to look quite right in stockinette stitch. But in lace, it means that you can have a little bit of a foof, if you like, if you wanted to make it even bigger for the upper part before you gathered it in at the cuff. So it actually worked really well with the design, but it was rooted in practicalities and the knitting experience of knitters. Same with the body, it's knit from the top down. Originally I'd envisioned solid lace, but the very long lace rows, they required a lot of concentration and felt like you needed little breathing gaps in it. So it meant that I did a couple of repeats, and then I did a stripe of garter, a couple of repeats, and then a stripe of garter. So I love the way it came out and the way it looks, but it was also tied in with making it a more pleasant knitting experience so that it didn't get overwhelming with the lace. Too much concentration, too many potential for errors, so that you could have a little rest spot. And it had a nice little knock-on side effect, because if you wanted to add shaping in the body, it meant that you actually could. You have the stitches down the side here are going to have a little bit of room where you've got the garter stripes here, and you can easily add increases. So if you want to do A-line shaping, you can do that. You could actually even make it go in and out, but with the design, I don't think it would work. I think A-line could work if you undersized a little bit, or sized down a little for the bust. And then if you have 4 increases, one on each side here and one on each side here on your garter rows, then you're going to have one more lace stitch pattern repeat, so you're not going to fall out of pattern, and then that can happen in each one in between. So that was like I suppose a fortuitous accident, that it wasn't planned until I had it on the needles. So you can probably see that a lot of the designing does happen on the needles. I'll have a plan, I'll draw things out, I'll have my swatches done. As I'm knitting through it, I start changing design features so that things make more sense for knitters, because of the fact that as I'm knitting it, I'm the knitter, and I try and force myself, rather than rushing through it, to take my time, slow down, and make knitterly decisions, if you know what I mean, as opposed to just designer decisions. So then ideally when you finish the pattern, the two should come together, so it's a really interesting design, and you look and you go, oh, I want to go knit that, but also a very interesting knitting experience that flows naturally and has lots of spots where you can add your own interpretations in, or your own sizings and things like that. So that's the first thing. I wanted to talk to you about today was just the background and my thinking behind, well, the lassa, which is Irish for lace, the design, but it kind of applies to most of my other designs as well, and particularly designs that I've given myself enough breathing space so that I can really take my time going through and allow myself to make all those changes and decisions as I'm processing the design in my own head, really. So, but yeah, that's the first thing that's going on my head today. And the next thing, I'm going to take you downstairs to the shop, and I want to talk about different yarns. Just kind of poke around the shop, pull out a few different yarns and talk about different yarn types, different fibers, different spinning methods, and how they come into my design and how I think about them. I mean, it might be something I end up extending into another blog session if you've got more interest in it, but I might just do a quick introduction downstairs. So see you downstairs. So I've come on downstairs now to the studio to talk a little bit about yarns with you. So yarns are very, very important, the one you end up choosing for your project, because sometimes you maybe don't have a choice because it's whatever you happen to have in your stash, so you really want to work it into what you're doing. But if you are going out and you want to buy yarn for a particular project, then you need to be very careful with how it's spun, the fiber blend, and all of those things to make sure that it's going to behave the way you want it to behave. So for instance, like the two main ways yarn are spun is going to be either a woolen spun or a worsted spun. Traditionally in Ireland, we have a lot of woolen spun, and you'll have yarns like the Blasta or Donegal yarn, soft Donegal. So woolen spun is where when it's carded, all of the fibers are only partially flattened out, so they're still left a little bit higgledy-piggledy. And what that actually means then, when it's spun, it's going to retain a little bit of air. So it's going to be quite light, quite airy, but when you hold it up and look at it, it's got hairiness basically. So it looks a little bit hairy. It's never going to feel quite as smooth, even when you've got a yarn like the soft Donegal, which is merino. By virtue of the way it was spun, it's actually going to have a little bit more roughness to it. So that's the woolen spun. Then you've also got a worsted spun, which is going to be stuff similar to this. So you've got fibre spates, vivacious 4-ply, coop knits, and this one is newer worsted. And all of those are worsted spun. And that one is kind of a more refined yarn, as in when it's carded, it's all smoothed in one direction, and it's going to, when it's spun, it's going to be much smoother, much denser. So when you pick it up, it's kind of got a bit more weight to it. It's a bit heavier, and it feels, it knits differently, it feels differently. It'll give you a very crisp stitch definition, but it's also kind of unforgiving. So if you've got loose stitches in there, it'll be really obvious. Whereas woolen spun, the stitch definition isn't always super, super crisp, but it has a very, very magical change when it's blocked, because it has held air, and so when it's blocked, it gives it kind of, it poofs. It's got a big poof to it when it's actually blocked after you're finished with it. So that makes it very, very good for projects that you want a little bit lighter, where the stitch pattern is going to be a bit dense by itself. So that would often be things like cables, in particular, are heavily cabled items, longer garments, anything where the fabric or the stitch pattern is heavier. If you can have a lighter weight fiber, it means that it's not going to have as much density. So even at the same yarn weight like this, a worsted spun versus a woolen spun, knitting the same item with what looks like the same yarn weight, if you're looking at the yardage, the amount of yardage on it, this is going to feel a little heavier and denser, and this is going to feel a bit lighter. If it's plain stockinette stitch and things like that, it's not going to be terribly critical, but if the actual stitch pattern is heavy, then you want to go for something that feels a little lighter. The other thing that I suppose kind of tied with this would be superwash. It's usually going to be a worsted spun, where it's actually been chemically treated so that it's going to be able to withstand the motion and rubbing of within a machine, and it can actually handle a little bit of heat without felting on you. So it means that if you're going to be using it for items that will be for kids or are going to be passed on to somebody who won't hand wash it, it's perfect, because you know that it's still going to be usable even if they slightly mistreat it. Or if it's something you know you're going to need to wash a lot, superwash is very helpful. But by virtue of the chemical coating, you'll actually find that there's a certain amount of slip on the fibers. And what that means is, if you're doing something that's heavier, it's going to take some of the qualities of the woolen spun, whereby it stretches and is weightier, and it even exaggerates it. It's going to mean that you're much more likely to have things stretch out of shape. I was talking, in fact, to somebody, to the previous couple of sessions ago, where I had been talking about blocking it. Superwash even more so with that, because when you block superwash, all of the cohesiveness is gone, and so it's very, very dangly, slippy, moves all over the place. You have to be very, very careful with it when you're minding it. So bearing in mind the way something is spun is very important when you're picking your project. And then what it's made of is important as well. So if it's wool, you've got a fairly good idea of how it's going to behave with the addendum as to how it was spun. But then if there's other ones where you've got different plant fibers or other animal fibers, so this one is a brushed alpaca, very different again. Going to be, a knittle goes a long way, so it looks very fine, but because it's so puffy and it fills in the stitches in between, so it can be knit very loosely. This one is an Ito yarn, and it is a silk blend, very fine, so it's often knit with something. But plant fibers, typically, because they don't have the elasticity of animal fibers, they lend themselves to different types of stitch patterns. So lace patterns will work very well, things that are going to be a little bit more open stitch pattern and things like that. And also I find that if some spinning techniques add a little bit of elasticity into it, chainette construction or something where it's just got a small bit of bounce can mean that it's just got a tiny bit of elasticity. But overall, keeping an eye on the type of pattern you're using with this means that it's going to come out the way you want it to come out. So the two big things to look out for when you are trying to either substitute yarns or pick yarns for a project are, what are the fibers and how they're going to behave when you're knitting them, and then also how it's spun, which it won't necessarily be written on the yarn, but you can ask about it, or it might be obvious from the photographs which way it's spun, and that will have a big impact in how it knits up. So it's one of the reasons why having a few random skeins of different types of yarn are very, very handy to have in the house, because you can swatch with them and you can figure out if it's going to work for your project before you get a larger amount of it. So testing them out and swatching and making a judgment call can be really helpful. So that's your little daily insight into fibers and different types of spinning. And come join me on the next blog. And if there's more questions you have for me, just pop them up here. Don't forget to come and subscribe if you want to make sure you know when the next one's coming out. So thanks for joining me.